Everyone, I've got a brand new artwork to show off and I'm taking you behind the scene to see how I created this art from scratch to finish using Blender and some of free Blender add-ons. So I'll guide you through essential steps of creating this art in this step-by-step tutorial, but this journey didn't start in Blender. To create a good art we need a good idea. So I grabbed my sketchbook and before we go to Blender I want to quick sketch the idea. Because I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but I already have the idea in my mind. There is some building, abandoned building. Perhaps this is a medieval building, maybe partly destroyed and left forever. Somewhere in the swamps, surrounded by dark forest and fog. I don't know, but this image came to me quite recently and I just thought that maybe it would be a good idea to draw this and also to show you how I usually start my arts. Usually people grab references and start doing something right in Blender, but I love drawing and sketching my ideas and then turning them into 2D artwork. A ton of my pieces began on paper. This is such a magic, you know. For me it's like a meditation. You dive in your thoughts, not even sure what's coming, just letting pencil line dance across the page, a messy chaos where a hidden image starts to picture. Even without details, you feel the shape of something ancient taking form, like a lost ruin coming back to life, until a rough sketch emerges and ready to become an art. Alright, I have a sketch and I think we're ready to jump into Blender and start converting this simple drawing into a 3D artwork. I also made an additional sketch, but I'll only do one of them in Blender, the one we started with. Maybe I'll leave the second for the next time, I don't know, or if you want, you can use it for yourself. Alright, let's go to Blender, and the first things I always start with the blocking. As usual, I'll begin with the basic cube. I'll add it to the scene and let's change the size of this cube so it's roughly like our building in the central part of the sketch. Since it's the biggest element, we can start with it. Next, I'll cut the object using the loop cut tool by pressing Ctrl R and increase the number of cuts to 2. Second step, let's make some additional extrusions to form the building according to the sketch using created faces. Do the same to the opposite side. And here we go, something similar to what's on sketch, but for now it's just a basic form. Using the same approach, let's add a roof to this object, scale then extrude faces. At this stage details aren't so important. The overall form of the model is more key to building correct proportions and scale. Basically, blocking is all about building the correct proportions of elements and ensure they all work together smoothly. Since we don't have many details yet, it's super easy to tweak the form, extrude faces to stretch them out, scale them to adjust the size, or even add the simple primitives like cylinders or spheres that are ready to use in Blender. This follows the most fundamental principles of creating any art. We start with the overall form and gradually move into the details. This process is like laying down a strong foundation. First, we shape the big, bold outlets, given the model is its basic structure. Then, step by step, we refine it, adding details and characters with each adjustments. Whether it's a rough drawing or a 3D scene, we build from the initial broad shape, letting the details emerge naturally. And once we're happy with how it looks and feels, we can move forward, filling with details, and at this point I switch to modeling to take it to the next level. Basically using the same basic primitives and polymodeling, I started in details. First, I create an entrance to race, maybe even extended it to one corner, turn it into a set of stairs that lead up to the second floor. Then I add beams and wooden supports to give it a structure. Perhaps I drop a few old boards lying around, which adds a touch of decay and add a bit of mass to the scene. These details are key to making it feel real. Things like scattered boards or objects hint that this building was once lived and simply abandoned by people, leaving bits and pieces behind. Or maybe someone placed them there later after this place was left. Some scattered boards could even suggest a path into the abandoned building, a way to climb inside, leading a hidden spots within. All this builds a little story, showing that might have happened or could still happen. By adding these details, we give viewer a clue about movements, like where they might explore it as they stopped into this location, making this scene come alive with imagination. At this stage, it's good time to look for references to specific elements. The sketch gives us the overall shape and the idea, but for adding details, it's better to find some references to get things right from the start. We are aiming for realism, so checking out real objects and try to recreate them in your artwork. Not copying exactly, but recreating the feel and the look of the elements. The goal is to stay within the original sketch and its main idea. But if you're unsure about how to handle certain parts, you can always find inspiration in photo examples for example, on Pinterest. Unfortunately, Pinterest is full of AI-generated images these days, which can make it tough to find real photos for references. If nothing fits your idea, try some photo stocks to hunt for real photos. This may also work for the next stage of texturing the objects and entire scene. Searching for the reference is a key step in the process, especially if you're a beginner and don't have enough experience. So I've got this model based on my sketch. In some places I strayed a bit from the sketch, while in others I did things differently. 3D gives a better sense of understanding than a simple sketch, letting me refine the idea more accurately, since I can rotate the model and look at it from all angles. Now the really exciting part. I'm going to texture all these elements. Essentially, we have two ways to do this. We can use simple texture with the shader editor, or we can go with texture paint, which allows us to draw texture exactly as the artist imagines them, in this case, just how I want to see this. I think this more creative approach, and that's one I'm going to use. I already shared this stage on my X and Instagram, where I've got tons of comments asking me to show it in details, so let's dive in. I'll be using the Ucupaint add-on for this, but before we start painting we need to unwrap all these elements first. Since I'm going to use texture paint, I need to do a proper unwrap with no overlapping parts. This is crucial when preparing a model for painting. Look, just pressing box projection will not work. I want the texture to look clean, with no obvious seams or texture tiling, especially on the geometry corners. To do this right, I manually cut the model myself, placing seams in spots where they're hard to notice or will not mess up how the texture looks. I select the needed edges and hit mark seam. Then I go to unwrap. To check if the unwrap is correct, I use checker texture. Likely I can add it straight in Ucupaint add-on and start using it right now. If some part looks incorrect, I can adjust them by rotating them in the right direction and fix the scale to match the overall size. Next, I use a pack island in the UV editor to organize everything. For identical objects we can copy UVs using Ctrl-L and copy UV maps, just like we use in link materials. This makes the boring unwrapping process a bit easier. I'm not a huge fan of unwrapping, and I know a few people who like it, but we have to do this if we want to get texture paint looking correct. Alright, let's dive into texture paint. As I mentioned, I'm using Ucupaint add-on for this, and for those who've checked out my texture paint of Lighthouse tutorial on my Patreon or my other videos on the channel, you might know that we can set up two materials in the shader editor, create a texture mask or color attribute, connect the right node to the factor in the mix shader node, switch to vertex paint or texture paint mode, and use regular brushes to paint where we want one material or the other material. But with Blender default tools, every time we add new materials or mask, we have to do it manually. That's fine for simple tasks like mixing two materials, but for complex texturing it can be pretty boring. Long before I started using Blender, I worked with Substance Painter, where this process is easier since we just work with layers like in Photoshop, which is definitely simpler. But I don't like jumping between programs, and that's why I switched into Blender, because I can do everything in one place. Sure, some things are easier, some are harder, but it's almost always possible. Now the Ucupaint add-on is like having Substance Painter inside Blender. It uses Blender tools, but instead of messing with the shader editor, adding nodes, textures and masks manually, you can handle it all in one window with this add-on. It even set up a layer structure, making it way simpler, faster and more comfortable. Plus, the add-on is free and available right in Blender extension. Just enable it and you are ready to paint. Now, instead of creating a bunch of materials myself in shader editor, I can just create a new layer. I hit the plus button and select Open Images to single layer. This allows me to pick all the textures I need for each channel, like base color, roughness and normal, and add them to the layer with one click. As you can see, a new stone layer is on the model, and we have all the essential settings for each channel, and I can switch to use bump plus normal if I want. They're all basic functions like scale, offset and rotation for each axis, which should feel familiar if you have worked with Blender before. The real power of this add-on is the ability to create layers, mix them using different masks, and paint over them to add dirt or weather effects, pretty much like we do it in Substance Painter. But now we don't need even Substance Painter. This is going to be a base layer called Stone, and let's create a second layer for the top material. I think it could be something like plaster or concrete, I don't know, something like that. Let's also tweak the texture scale a bit. For each channel we can add different modifiers. They are called modifiers in this add-on, but they are basically the same nodes we know from the shader editor, like hue saturation value, which is super handy for adjusting the color and tone of texture. For example, I don't like this texture is too bright. I'd prefer a darker, less saturated look. The same goes to the bottom stone layer. Alright, we have two layers, and to mix them I still need a mask, just like before. So, I'll select the top layer with the concrete since it's upper layer, and we need to create the mask for this layer. In Ucupaint it's super easy to make a mask. There are a lot of options, including procedural textures, but I'm going with new image mask. I'll name it and use 4K resolution, matching the whole project. Right after adding the mask, I switch to texture paint mode. Since the mask starts white, it means only the top layer shows up, and to reveal the bottom layer, stone layer, I need to paint with black color on this mask, where I want that material to be visible. It looks pretty rough right now, but this is just a start. Also, using mid-level in normal channel, we can adjust how much higher the top layer sits above the bottom one. Of course, this is all about normal map, not displacement. So keep in mind it's illusion, not actual geometry changes. Next, to make a transition between these two materials looks more realistic, I can use a texture mask. I'll add the texture of some stone cracks here, and by switching to stencil display mode, we can paint a smoother, more lifelike blend between these two materials. Basically, using texture as a mask let us draw different effects to combine various materials into one realistic surface. This way I can keep adding different layers with various materials or effects. For example, I've added a new layer with a black material, and using texture paint I can draw dirt, streaks or natural weather effects on the wall. To do this, I'll add a marching streak mask to project it onto the wall where I want these details to show up. By the way, to avoid adding texture and masks from scratch every time, you can save the brush with this texture as a copy. This adds it a new brush to blend a brush set, which is way more convenient. You can use it in all your project without reloading the masks each time. So I just select a part of the wall and project the streak texture onto it again. I can grab a standard brush to erase any extra parts or soften the edges, create different natural effects on the main material. This helps make it look super realistic and visually stunning. And here another cool brush trick. You can create an endless variety of mask brushes yourself using Photoshop, or I use Krita. I just take a brush from my drawing collection or any texture, whatever you want, make a print, save it, and use it as a texture for the brush. This way you can build your own brush collection and reuse them across all projects. Relying on just a basic round brush will not give you that awesome effect, but it's easy to customize based on standard brushes, save them once and keep using them whenever you need. Ucupaint makes it super easy to work with materials and textures, letting us create all kinds of masks from basic procedural texture to hand-drawn masks for the perfect specific effects. The procedural way gives us flexibility, but texture paint let us craft exactly what we want. Yeah, this method requires much more time. We need to unwrap the model properly before painting, plus set up masks, brushes and more. Of course, with procedural approach we can do it with just a few clicks and not stress about it. But I love this process. I always prefer more creative methods, and even if it takes me a couple of days to paint in the texture, I will get necessary result instead of non-control procedural way. Plus, Ucupaint really boosts the power of texture paint in Blender. It's pretty much like having Substance Painter, and with this add-on you don't need to mess around in the shader editor with tons of material, masks and textures. Everything works smoothly right in Ucupaint. I only recently started exploring Ucupaint. Well, I knew it exists, but I just found time to test it and check it out how it works on details. But Ucupaint definitely takes place in my go-to list of add-ons, which I use regularly. So let's move to the environment. I've created the terrain around the building using sculpting tools in Blender, Sculpting is also a key part of my workflow, and with Blender we can keep working on the project smoothly without needing to export it to ZBrush or anywhere else and import it again to Blender. But for working with the environment materials, I'll keep using Ucupaint because there is one feature I really love the most. But let's start by adding a new material with the basic channel. By the way, we can also add a layer with checker texture to check if everything displays well and there are no weird UV stretches. And that's a favorite feature I mentioned. It's our ability to work with displacement. In the normal channel, we can turn on displacement setup to enable working with displacement in Ucupaint. And let's add a basic ground layer to see how it works. In the normal channel, we can now affect the displacement just like we did with normal map, but this time it's not just an illusion, we are seeing real displacement taking shape on the scene. Alright, let's add the second material and the mask for painting. Now check this out. If you've seen my video where I explained how to make smooth transition between two materials using displacement map and the mix mass nodes, the Ucupaint add-on handles all this for us. We don't need to build that whole node setup ourselves, we just paint and adjust the mid-level value for each layer to get the right height. For example, the stones will clearly sit higher. And notice how it not just a rough brush mark on the surface, but a natural blend between the materials, following the texture. That's exactly what I love about this add-on. We can create any natural transition between materials and consider the texture to get a natural and realistic surfaces. Also, after we finish texture paint, we can bake the textures. This is super useful if you plan to use a model outside Blender, like in Unreal Engine or another program, or for other purposes, whatever you want. But if you don't need that and, like me, you mostly work in Blender, you can keep going with that with Painted. Plus, it's handled later on. If you decided to add more details at later stage, you can easily jump back to Ucupaint and keep painting without any problems. Even if you already finished the whole scene, it's not a problem to keep painting the model, blending it more smoothly with environment as you want. And now let's move to the environment. As I mentioned before, this will be something like swamp and forest. Well, not just any swamp, I imagine it was once a thriving forest or an outcast area, maybe with a building or even a main watchtower standing tall. After it was abandoned and left by people, nature took over, swallowing everything and leaving our building standing alone in the middle of the swamp. See how we can tell a story through the environment? This is what I always talking about. Don't just throw models into the scene without thinking. Your art should share a story. It doesn't have to be obvious, maybe it's a hidden meaning, but it should be a tale that makes people want to explore. A picture is like a book. Both tell a story just in different ways, fooling you with every detail. To create a forest, I am using another awesome add-on, Secret Paint. This add-on is also free and let us scatter objects in the scene using Blender's paint tools. All I need to do is select the trees, pick the plane where I want the forest and start painting. For me it's W, but by default, as I remember, it's a Q hotkey. I think the reason I use the Secret Paint add-on instead of another scatter tool for Blender is the same as why I use Texture Paint. It gives me fine control over what I'm doing. I can select the tree I want, pick the plane where I want to place them, and just paint the area where I'd like the trees to appear. Plus, we have settings for the whole scatter system, like scale, random scale and rotation, but what really stands out to me about this add-on is this. I'll grab the tree and change the brush to add. Instead of randomly scattered objects across the scene, I can now place trees exactly where I want, looking through my camera and preview. This means I can add a tree, see how it fits the frame, adjust it, delete it, or reposition it closer or further from the camera. Plus, I can move a specific tree or object within the selected scatter system, placing it more precisely with matching the terrain using brushes. Or I can even adjust the scale of a single object locally with brushes. Basically, working with the Secret Paint add-on feels like being a gardener growing your own forest. You can shrink or grow the size of trees, add more in just the right spot, and craft the perfect scene step by step. By the way, for these creepy dry trees, I used the Any add-on. It's a paid add-on, but it's totally worth the price. It works on geometry nodes and lets me create all kind of trees right inside Blender. It's perfect for me. I love being able to make the exact trees I need for the environment without leaving Blender. Alright, I want to set some accent using light. We could just skip this, but check it out. This is how the scene looks right now with just ambient light. It's not bad, but it feels really flat. But I'll add a texture light from my collection to highlight the main object. This adds more depth to the scene and draws our focus to what matters most. This beam of light pulls the main object out of the general darkness, putting the spotlight right where it belongs. Since I'm using a texture light, in this case a leaf texture, check this out. The light varies, stronger in some spots and softer in others. This not only creates a forest-like atmosphere with uneven light, but also helps emphasize the main compositional highlights even more. Alright, finally let's do some post-production and add a few post effects. And again, I stay in Blender for this, not need Photoshop or anything else, it's just handy to use Compositing in Blender. And let me show you some tricks. Okay, first I'll add the color balance node. With this node we can adjust shadows, highlights and do some color grading using color wheels. And here a key point. In Blender we also have scopes. Maybe you didn't even know about that, but you can find these tools in the side panel. There is like graphs showing data. Basically scopes like our eyes. Scopes analyze the image showing how it looks in digital form. The program checks every pixel and displays its digital value on the graphs. Look, for example, if I make the image darker by adjusting the black point with lift, you can see the graph shift downward. Then if I increase the white point with gain, the graph stretch upward. This way, scopes can tell how dark or bright my image is, and spots where shadows are too deep or highlights are too strong. I can also use color wheels to tweak the colors, and these show up on the vector scope, which tell me how oversaturated or desaturated my image is. Plus, it shows the overall color scheme. This way, we can precisely control the color and tone of our image. I always use scopes to analyze it. Your display might be set up wrong, poorly calibrated, or even a bad one. Scopes never lie, because it's mathematical analysis of images and aren't affected by your monitor. If you want to work like a pro artist, you can't ignore scopes. It's pretty big topic overall, and I've got a detailed tutorial on how to use scopes in Blender on my Patreon. I drop the link in the description to this video. Okay, the next node I use a color correction. This one has all the settings for highlight, midtones, shadows, and overall master adjustments. So I'll boost the saturation a bit and maybe add some contrast. And yeah, look at how my changes show up on the waveform. Oh yeah, let me explain something important here. The classic way to work with waveform is to keep your graph value within a safe range from 0 to 1000, where 0 is the black point down at the bottom of the graph and 1K is the white point up at the top. Your image should stay between these lines to keep everything looking good and working correctly, not stick to the bottom or to the top, but being within these boundaries. For instance, we can see on the waveform graph that there are some really dark areas where the curve is stuck at the bottom edge. And we can see this on the image right here. In this spot we can't see any details here, just a dark hole. That's what waveform tells us. We have got some dark hole zones. If you want to keep some information there, it's better to leave the black point so we can see details in that part on the render. I can go to color correction, shadow, gain, and raise the value until some details there become visible. And now we can see more details in these areas. Alright, next I'll add a hue correct. This node let us adjust color locally using hue, saturation and value for each color. We'll use the vector scope for this. To start, I'll go to hue and tweak the colors a bit. I want to shift the red closer to yellow and yellow closer to red. Notice how the color direction changes on the vector scope. Then, in value, I slightly raise the level of the color to make them a bit brighter. By the way, we can also go back to the color balance node and use gamma to adjust the image color too. And you'll see these changes reflected on the vector scope. I still don't like this part, and the waveform show it that shadow under the roof is way too dark. I think we can pull out a lot more details from the shadow. Yeah, maybe like this. Now it's easier to see some details there. For example, if I make it darker, look at this, and now, yeah, this feels better. But the overall image got a lot brighter, so I can boost the contrast here to balance it out. The next step, I add vignette effect, and I'll use a simple ellipse mask for this. Something like this. Next, a blur node. This gives us the image, and I'll combine it with our render using mix color node. Let's change it to multiply. Here's before and after. With the factor settings, I can control how strong the vignette effect show up on the image. I also love using lens distortion and other lens effects like chromatic aberration and distortion to give the scene a cinematic look. And finally, let's add a bit of film grain. In the Blender 4.5 they have set a white noise texture node, so now we can add noise right in Blender without switching to other program or using extra footage for this. If you're working on the animation, you can even animate the noise to create a film grain effect. I'll use mix color node and add a noise to our render. Let's change to multiply. As usual with the factor settings, we can control how much of the effect we want. Alright, let's finally compare our render and the post-production version. Here is a raw render and here is our final artwork. I really like it, it looks great, and everything was done right here in Blender, well, except the sketch of course. I'd say this, no matter how hard to try to swap my paper sketchbook to a digital one, it just doesn't feel the same. Sure, we can draw directly in Blender, and I've shown that in one of my videos where I sketch inside Blender, but I don't know, there is something special about a paper sketchbook, a vibe you can't feel the same using a digital one. Everything else, no problem, Blender's become an all-in-one tool now, and I am amazed how it's growing. Take the latest conference where they show off upcoming features, especially Compositing 5.0. I can't wait for Blender 5, even just for beta, just to check it all out. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel, hit the like button, and don't forget about my Patreon, where you'll find extra materials for each YouTube video, the scene from this one and the model I made for this artwork available on my Patreon. See you in the next video, bye!